Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast, episode 1. This is something brand new, but it's been in the making for a while, and I thank you so much for joining me here today, wherever you are and whatever time you're listening. I'm coming on the heels of a career in radio that I never envisioned. It was an amazing thing that I wound up in radio after dreaming about this as a teenager, listening to talk radio steadily for years and years at my home when I lived in Southern California. And coming to Virginia all those years ago, back in 1998, and listening to talk radio here, never in the world thinking that I would have the opportunity to participate, to be a radio host. Well, all of that changed a few years later, as I was elected to the Charlottesville City Council, the first Republican elected to that position since Darden Tao back in the late 1980s, and probably the last in history. My city council career was very successful in many, many ways, but the Democrats in this community didn't like me there, and although I received more votes in my second election, my attempt to be reelected, I lost. And I was wondering, after having appeared on the radio for those 4 years and so many times over the 4 years, what the future held for me. Interestingly enough, the future held radio, as I was called just a few weeks later by WINA, which had hosted me as a guest for those 4 years. And WINA called and said, "Hey, would you like to be on the radio?" I'd never had a better phone call in my life, I don't think, and I was so excited for the opportunity. And what happened then was I started working weekends, and after just a few months of working weekends and having no real knowledge about how to do a radio show, I was asked to sit in for the morning show, WINA Morning News, which at the time was the most listened to radio program in Central Virginia. I had big shoes to fill as I was sitting in the seat of the late Dick Mountjoy, who had taken ill and wasn't going to be coming back. And what was initially supposed to be a temporary position turned into, well, instead of 3 months, about 10 months on the air. And when that time ended and a permanent replacement was found for Dick, I disappeared from the radio airwaves in Charlottesville. And the listening public, to my great surprise, went nuts. There were so many calls to the radio station, so many complaints. My voice was something that was missed, and it was just incredible what happened. And so within just a few months, I was back on the air with my own program, The Schilling Show. That was back in 2008. The birth of the Schilling Show, unlike anything Charlottesville had ever seen before. And I was on and successful for the course of a year, and then, of course, we had a lot of economic problems. And the Schilling Show was removed from the air. My voice was silenced once again, and when I was given the pink slip and told to leave, they said, "We're waiting for the storm that follows." And the storm followed again, and within 1 month this time, the Schilling Show was back on the air, this time with 2 hours instead of 1, and we've been on ever since. Over that time, I've won many awards. The Schilling Show's been recognized by the Associated Press countless times for investigative journalism and many other things. Also recognized by the Virginia Association of Broadcasters for our excellence in covering stories of Central Virginia and beyond. The stories we've broken on this little tiny blog at shillingshow.com and this small radio show that broadcasts out of Charlottesville, Virginia, have been covered multiple times on the Drudge Report, making front page above the fold news, on The Blaze, on Fox News, Fox and Friends, Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, even the BBC covering our stories and interviewing this host. It's been a wild ride. But tough times in the radio business are back. And it's particularly different now because the advertisers who were with us on terrestrial radio for all those years, the advertisers who cared about this voice being in the community, Most of them have diminished or completely eliminated advertising during this difficult time. And thus, they're not there to be a voice for my time. So what happened as a response to the difficult times in the radio business? Well, my 2-hour program was cut in half. My salary was cut by significantly more than that, and I was told to take it or leave it. Part of me wanted to say, as the song says, take this job and shove it. But that was not the rational part of me. That was the emotional part. And so I said, okay, let me remain on, let me do what I do. But there was an outpouring of community support that followed immediately. And I'm so grateful for the many members of this community that value the work we've been doing here. And I've got to tell you, it doesn't really feel like work. After all of these years doing this, it's never felt like work. Sure, it takes time, it takes effort, but it is a passion for me to do this. And so with this outpouring of community support, people coming forward financially to make up for what had been taken away, but also to provide ideas and encouragement, here comes the birth of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast, which is what you're listening to today. And it's pretty remarkable because I probably never would have stepped out into this venture had it not been for the disruption that occurred in my day-to-day schedule and what I'd been doing over the past 13 years or so. And sometimes you got to get pushed out of the nest. So now, in this new format, we have more time for investigations and exposés. No rigid boundaries for interviews. As you know, terrestrial radio is limited and broken into time blocks, and here we can go more free form. A broader range of topics, some of the things, and I wasn't often limited in what I talked about on the air, but there probably were some things that were considered to be very controversial that I had to stay away from. The broader range of topics now will prevail without the limitations. I think one of the greatest regrets I've had in looking at the new venture, the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast, is the loss of the immediacy of live radio. Over the years, there have been so many interesting things that have happened to me live on the air, and I want to recount just a few of them for you to give you a sense of why I have some regret for losing this, because we're not going to be able to do a show the same way, at least not presently. There was a day when a guy named Mad Dog had won a prize on one of our sister stations, and Mad Dog walked in to my studio, into the WINA studio, while I was broadcasting live on the air looking for a prize. It was pretty remarkable because I had absolutely no idea who this guy was walking into the studio, and for all I knew, he could have meant me harm. He could have been an angry listener. But I just engaged him in conversation. He appeared to be at least slightly inebriated, and it made for great live radio. There was another time back in the early days of the program where I got the wrong guest on the air. This happened, and I still don't quite understand who it was, but I was working through a booking agent, and he gave me the wrong phone number for the guest. And so I had something all planned out for this author, and I don't remember who it was. And our call screener at the time called up the phone number and put the guy on the air. And it turned out it was a completely wrong person. I had no idea who this guy was. I hadn't prepared. I hadn't read the book. And yet, I conducted the interview live on the air without knowing a thing about the person I was talking to other than his name and the title of his book. And we had a fascinating cold interview. Also, there was a city council candidate by the name of Anson Parker, I think his name was, and he came into the studio, and his whole candidacy was a joke. He was a progressive who masqueraded as a Republican, and we had what I would call a semi-contentious interview, and I think was the only guest in the history of the Schilling Show who got up and stormed out in the middle of an interview. It was great radio. Oh, and then, of course, there was getting served with a court subpoena live on the air. Somebody from the sheriff's office, a very nice sheriff's deputy, showed up at WINA one time and wanted to serve me with a subpoena to appear in court for a court case. And I invited her off the air to come in on the air and serve me live before my audience. It was a remarkable event. I will never, ever forget how cool that was and how cool it was that she agreed to do it. You talk about great live radio. And then there was the time we had Gas Can Man come to town. We did a big event over at Preston Avenue Shell. And we had half-price gasoline during the Obama years, and this character named Gas Can Man, this was going on all over the country. We put out the word that we're doing half-price gasoline, and there were huge lines, just probably a mile-long line to get gas for $1.86 a gallon, set up out in the parking lot. And then the police showed up, and they said, you can't do this. And, it was just crazy. It was a wild 2 hours on the air. And overall this time, I've appreciated taking live calls. The phone lines are always open on the Schilling Show was one of our taglines. And it was something that I wanted to continue to do, but I wasn't sure how to do it since this is a podcast and not live radio. So I came up with a bunch of ideas about how we might be able to at least begin to integrate calling or the idea of interaction with our listeners back to the program in the podcast format. First off, I thought about calls to the Schilling Show hotline being played on the air and responded to. Now, I used to do that. In fact, we used to have the Schilling Show hotline voicemail caller awards, and it was a feature of the program every week, and we gave prizes to people who participated in that way. And we would play the calls on the air and let you vote on who was the winning call of the week. So we have a Schilling Show hotline at 434-218-2349, 24/7 a day. And I might put that to great use in the Schilling Show podcast for my open phones, news analysis, commentary, and insight segment. We'll also want to integrate more email questions and comments that you have into this segment, allowing me to respond to them. And I've also considered a possible live broadcast podcast window with live call-ins wherein I would say, okay, this Friday between 9 and 10, I'm going live. We'll put out a live signal and we'll put it out live on social media perhaps where people could send their questions in or even call in to a special phone number and interact with me live during the program. So I'm working on all of that. Now, in stepping out into this, I have to think about the financial aspects of it. This is what's now called community-supported investigative journalism. While I'm still Charlottesville's community watchdog, there's a whole new way about the funding of this since I'm not being supported by a commercial entity, and so you have the opportunity to participate. We've set up PayPal and also something called Patreon, which I was previously unfamiliar with, but which is a way for you, either one of these, PayPal or Patreon, that would allow you to give one-time gifts, or it would allow you to support us on a monthly basis on Patreon with various levels of benefits that you would be able to get as a result of your free will participation and donation to this host in his efforts to keep you informed and to look out for what's going on in this community. All of that information is available for you online at shillingshow.com. There are big buttons there where you can check out these options and opportunities. And of course, as many people have done in these past months or so, direct donations are always appreciated and welcome. I thank you so much for the many gifts and your outpouring of support to this host as we attempt to get this effort launched and then make it sustainable. I've often told you that no person is an island. And it's something that I've said because people feel alone in this community as it becomes increasingly hostile to conservative and Christian worldviews. No person is an island, meaning whenever you're listening to this program, there's a lot of other people listening to the Schilling Show and the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast who feel the same way you do, but many of them are frightened. They're frightened to speak out in this community. They're frightened for their business, for their persons, for their families, for people that might work for local government and are known to be a part of the person's family who's speaking out. But there are many who think like you and share your concerns. We'll continue to serve a unique function in Charlottesville and beyond, both on the air and here on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast, because there's no one doing what we're doing. And it is my great honor to have been doing this over the past 13 years and now to launch this brand new venture. So let's head into today, episode 1 of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. The topic today is masks, lawsuits, fear, and pandemonium in the midst of pandemic.
Join the revolution. Online at shillingshow.com.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues now with attorney Matt Hardin suing Governor Northam and a host of others. Matt Hardin, thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Hi, it's great to be on the podcast, Rob.
Okay, so let's talk about this executive order that prompted the various lawsuits that we're going to talk about in a minute. What did the executive order say? I think it was number 63.
It was. Executive Order 63 said that all patrons of various establishments in the Commonwealth, basically, anybody that has a brick building, the patrons have to wear a mask, and if they don't, it's a misdemeanor penalty. And then the businesses, if they don't require their patrons to wear masks indoors, they get enforced against through the Department of Health. So they could lose their business license. They could be enjoined against operating their businesses. They could get shut down, that sort of thing.
So this is problematic in a lot of ways. Let's first talk about the impact on the individual. Somebody like me who was a plaintiff in one of your lawsuits, why should individuals be concerned about a mandate like this?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. One is you're always concerned when the government does things they don't have the power to do. That's concerning from a constitutional perspective. I think that another is there are risks to health from wearing masks that aren't talked about. It can trigger asthma. The masks become a bacterial sink, cause all sorts of problems, including lung infections. And lastly, you're susceptible to felony prosecution if you wear a mask that hides your identity in public. That's a Class 6 felony in Virginia and has been since we were fighting the Klan a few decades ago.
You know, neither one of us is a medical doctor. At least I don't think you are. You wear a lot of hats. But I was speaking with a medical doctor this morning, Dr. Battig, and he told me that the particle size of the virus is so small that these masks are virtually worthless against it in many ways, unless it had some sort of a clumping residual effect. And so there's still a lot of questions about the efficacy here. And as you referenced, it could even be harmful, the bacterial accumulation. One of my kids was told that, when they're participating in one of their team activities, that they now want them to wear masks while they're doing something that's intensively aerobic. Which, again, sounds like a very bad idea. It sounds like people really don't know what to do. They're trying to comply with the law, and yet they're being put in a position which is contradictory.
Well, I mean, exercising with a mask has been established to be dangerous. And in our Executive Order 63, they actually did exempt exercise because I think even the governor's willing to admit that. But yes, these masks often don't work. And I think what you see is the medical establishment, if you say defer to the experts, well, the experts can't make up their minds either. The CDC and the World Health Organization have both backtracked multiple times on whether to wear masks or not. Initially, we were told don't wear masks, then wear masks. The WHO initially said masks, no masks, and now they're back to masks. These organizations can't make up their minds. And if you remember in the beginning, it was all about the N95 masks, and everybody was saying the N95 masks are really the key here because they are much better at keeping particulates out. And now it's surgical masks or a sweater over your head or just about anything works now. Yes, a bandana. And I mean, I'm seeing this everywhere. When I go out to gas stations now, I'm seeing people wearing bandanas. It looks like I'm in Dodge City in 1870.
We're talking with attorney Matt Hardin about a lawsuit against Governor Northam and others regarding his executive order number 63. So the next thing we should talk about is how this is problematic for businesses. We have one business in this lawsuit, the one that I'm involved in, Toby Bausch from Toby's Pawn Shop. What were some of Toby's concerns?
Toby sells firearms, and so he's long been concerned when people come into his store wearing masks or hoodies or things that are covering up their face. What are they there for? Are they there to rob him? And he's never had a robbery, but he has been burgled at night. And I think when you sell firearms and you have large sums of cash in a store, pawn shops have valuable items that they have to hold as collateral. You get nervous when people come in and they're trying to hide who they are. So that creates a safety issue for him. And again, with the bacterial issues, do you want to force an employee to put themselves at risk of contracting a lung infection because of the bacterial sink effect? So that was Toby's concerns.
So yeah, he's in a bad place. As an employer, does he have any protection against an employee saying, "Hey, you made me wear this mask. I got sick because I was wearing a mask, and now I'm going to sue you"? I'm not saying any of his employees would do that, but hypothetically, could he be on the hook for some damage that occurred to an employee as a result of enforcing that mask wearing?
Well, I think that's the problem with the legal mess we're in right now is the government says that you're at risk if you don't protect your employees from coronavirus, but the government also says you're at risk if they get ill through other ways, and it's not just our workers' compensation laws, but I mean, coal miners for years that have gone down into the mines, that's part of their work, and they get sick later, they have to be compensated. It's the same thing. If you're wearing a mask because your employer says you have to wear a mask and you're later injured, I think your employer's on the hook for that. So the government has really created this situation where you're darned if you do and you're darned if you don't, because if you force them to wear a mask, you can get sued. If you don't force them to wear a mask, you can get sued.
When the governor issued his executive order, Matt, I guess he could have done something very simple to solve all of this. So I'm wondering about what the governor's options are going forward with this suit being laid on his table. What are the responses that he could make to it?
Well, 18.2-422 of the Code of Virginia says that the governor can waive our felony mask laws in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He can make it not illegal, at least, to wear a mask. If he follows certain rules, he has to say what mask is appropriate for the circumstances and how long the waiver lasts for and that sort of thing. So I think that's one of the things that the governor could and should do is follow the law, and if he really thinks people need to be wearing masks, he can waive the law if he follows very specific rules that are in the law. But I think it still doesn't solve the problem of him forcing people to wear masks. I mean, he can make it not against the law to wear a mask, but I still don't see where the governor thinks that he has the power to force people to wear masks. And I think you see this in other states. There was a federal district court in Maine where the judge said basically the governor wants to have his cake and eat it too when he calls something an order, but he also calls it a sincere suggestion. And I think that Governor Northam can offer all the suggestions in the world about wearing masks. He can even take away the penalty for wearing a mask. But when he tries to impose a penalty for not wearing a mask, I think that's where he crosses the line.
You referenced earlier the contradictions coming from the World Health Organization and other entities, the CDC, regarding masks. We've had masks for a long time, and maybe this is outside of your area of expertise, but I'm wondering why it is we don't know in the year 2020 whether or not wearing a mask is effective in situations like this and why we would be shifting guidance. It makes me very suspicious.
You know, I think that one of the problems that we have in medical science is that we're not willing to admit what we don't know. In the initial stages of this, the Middle East and Asia were very aggressive about mask wearing. But if you looked at the reasons why, and I think some of the prominent commentators pointed this out, the reasons that those societies were so caught up in mask wearing was really cultural traditions and superstitions from days gone by. It wasn't that people in Hong Kong, for example, had a much better understanding of the science than Americans. It was superstitions from ancient Chinese medicine that have sort of come through to the present day. The virus literature that I've seen, about 70% of our airborne viruses that we know exist, we don't know the etiology or what causes them. So the fact is 70% of these viruses, we don't know what causes them. And it doesn't necessarily matter either, because we have viruses that, as we've said, COVID supposedly originated in bats. The bats are asymptomatic. Cats and dogs can catch it. They're asymptomatic. And most of the time when people catch it, we're asymptomatic too. So these viruses don't get researched because it just doesn't matter.
We're talking with attorney Matt Hardin about a series of lawsuits filed against Governor Ralph Northam here in Virginia regarding his executive order number 63 and the mandating of mask wearing. So there also are some additional lawsuits that have been filed since we filed our suit on June 1st. Would you tell us what those are?
Yeah, there's another suit filed by a winery up in Fauquier County and another suit that was just filed in Fluvanna. I think that the winery is worth mentioning because there's a separate code section that says that if establishments with an alcohol license allow their place of business to become a gathering place for criminals, they lose their alcohol license and they get shut down. Well, unfortunately, right now, you're a criminal if you wear a mask and you're a criminal if you don't. So it's very hard to prevent your winery from becoming a gathering place for criminals.
Are there other businesses that have that sort of prohibition against a gathering place for criminals that could possibly get on board with a lawsuit?
It tends to be establishments that sell alcohol, so bars and restaurants would have the same issue. You notice there's a weird dichotomy in the regulations that applies to bars and restaurants because they count as establishments and you're supposed to wear a mask into them under Governor Northam's order at least, but not while you're eating. So I suppose you take it off and put it on between every bite or maybe between the salad and the main course. I'm not sure how that's supposed to work.
Matt Hardin, you mentioned earlier the governor and what he could have done to make this work a little better, which was to just waive that mask-wearing law. There must be some reason why he didn't. One that would come to mind immediately is that he's got a legally incompetent team that just didn't think of that. Is there some other reason you could conceive of why the governor didn't want to go down that road?
Well, I think given his history with his medical school yearbook, where he was either in blackface or in a Ku Klux Klan outfit, he's reluctant to be seen as racist in the present day. And if he legalized masks, I think he's concerned that he will be seen as legalizing racial intimidation, which is actually the point of the law. These laws were passed in at least the Code of Virginia of 1950 codified it. Back then it was a misdemeanor to combat the Klan. And so you don't want to waive a statute that was passed to combat the Klan, especially in this environment that we're in right now where everybody's claiming that racial injustice is what they're rallying against.
Tell us about the progress of the suits and what the next steps are that we'll be seeing along the line.
So in two of the suits, there has been a motion for a temporary injunction filed, an emergency motion. That's in Fauquier and in Albemarle County. We're hoping that the court will rule quickly because normally lawsuits take months and months and months to work through the courts, and in months and months and months, hopefully we won't be under these orders anyway, so I'd like to get a quick ruling. We have been frustrated in that because we've had one judge recuse, and we're not sure when we'll get a new judge assigned to the case to be able to hear these things and move it forward, but we'll keep pushing and doing everything we can.
There are also some interesting issues going on with Mr. Hingley, the Commonwealth's attorney in Albemarle County. Are you at liberty to discuss some of the anomalies there?
So the Code of Virginia says that when you sue a Commonwealth's attorney to prevent him from enforcing a law, the Attorney General's office is supposed to defend him. That's, I think, 2.2-506. And so that's the longstanding custom. And then if you sue a Commonwealth's attorney for money damages, they get a private lawyer paid for by the state. But it's a different system depending on whether you're suing them to prevent enforcement of a law or sue them for money damages. Jim Hingley is apparently trying to retain private counsel to defend himself in this lawsuit in Albemarle rather than allowing the Attorney General's office to defend him. And that's odd because that's not what the Code of Virginia contemplates. And we're not suing him for any money. We're not seeking any money from the taxpayers of Albemarle County. We're just seeking to not have this mask mandate enforced because it's unconstitutional and illegal. He shouldn't be spending money on private counsel. That would be my position on it. And I think somebody should ask Mr. Hingley why private counsel is necessary, and if so, why the taxpayer should have to pay for it.
Matt, I've heard people talking about experiences in various stores, and one person contacted me and said they were asked to leave a store. I asked very specifically when Dr. Norman Oliver was on my program last week, what happens to an individual? Can they be forced to leave a business establishment if they are not wearing a mask and will not put one on? We know there are some exceptions that the governor has granted to wearing masks. Maybe you could tell us about them, and what would be the legal position of an individual if that person was asked to leave a business because they were not wearing a mask?
So generally speaking, businesses have the right to throw people out for any reason or no reason, as long as it's not a racial bias issue or a few very narrow exceptions. So generally speaking, if you're asked to leave a business, you have to do so, and I don't want to put the businesses in a worse spot than they're already in because these businesses are being threatened too. But I will say that the governor has been very clear you do not have to answer whether you're not wearing a mask for health reasons, what that health reason is. So there are any number of health things that could be exacerbated by wearing a mask. For example, you could have asthma, you could fear a lung infection, you could have anxiety. And these things would be valid health concerns that would exempt you from the governor's order. And again, you do not have to explain to any business what your health concern is. You just have to explain that you have a health concern, and that health concern prevents you from wearing a mask.
If any one of these suits is victorious, does it apply broadly beyond the jurisdiction? I know recently there was a judgment against the Attorney General on a firing range, which was very narrowly applied to somewhere in Lynchburg, but excluded the others. So how would this work?
Automatically, it doesn't apply to anybody other than the plaintiffs. As a practical matter, I do think that either a judge would extend it or the Attorney General's office would insist that when the governor amends his order, he amend it in a way that applies statewide. I don't think that there's much practical danger of having the rules be different at one business versus another.
Attorney Hardin, is there anything else that people who are following this issue should be aware of?
I think that the important thing is to realize that power is supposed to start with the people and go through the legislature. The legislature is supposed to make laws, and the executive just enforces them. That's how our government has worked for 200 plus years. What you see right now is people thinking that our governor gets to make laws, and that's not how it's supposed to work. That's not how it ever has worked. And that's the problem, is we didn't get a say in any of these laws. We didn't go through normal notice and comment. We didn't get to write our representatives. We just woke up one day and had them imposed upon us, and that's not how it's supposed to work.
If anybody's interested in supporting your efforts in this lawsuit, we do have a GoFundMe page set up. And I guess the easiest way to find it is just go to GoFundMe.com and put in 3 words. Put in Northam, masks, and Charlottesville, and it'll pop up just like that.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
It's my pleasure to welcome here to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast, Dr. Charles Battig, policy advisor at the Heartland Institute, winner of the 2012 Schilling Show Citizen Patriot Award, a member of Virginia Scientists and Engineers for Energy and Environment, and of the CO2 Coalition. He's online at climateis.com, and he's also widely syndicated across the internet in his writings. Dr. Charles Battig, welcome to the very first edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Rob, thank you so very much, and I must say it's a real honor. Thank you. And they can't keep a good guy down, and I'm referring to you. You found a way to work around very nicely limitations imposed upon you elsewhere, so thank you very much.
Indeed. The thing I wanted to get to with you today, you recently published a piece on fear being the best tool of the ruling class. And Charles, as I look around me in this community, as I look around the country and the news reports that we see, as I look around the world, I see fear. I see people operating out of fear. I want to share with you a brief vignette of something that happened to me the other day. I was entering the Barracks Road post office at a time where there was almost nobody in there. There was one person at the counter working, one person waiting for service at the counter, and a person exiting through the main doors as I came in. And it was a lady who was probably at least in her mid-40s. She had a very substantial face mask on, and I had no mask. And as I was walking in maybe 2 feet from her, we came out the swinging doors at the same time, she going in the opposite direction. And she looked at me with this fearful and semi-angry look in her eyes, and then immediately put her hand up next to her face as if to guard her mask from my exhalation. I thought, my goodness, you talk about somebody who's operating out of fear. How did we get here?
Well, she's operating on a very basic level of human nature, and fear overrides reason. Fear is a self-protective instinct built into us, and it's one of the basic drives. So the unknown inspires fear. It's a defense mechanism. You see something you don't know, you fear it. You can either challenge it or fight or flight. So she just chose to put the side of you out of her sight, and thereby what you can't see won't hurt you. It leads to a whole series of similar sorts of comments, but she's just reacting on a very primitive, non-reasoning level.
Charles, one of the things, it was sad, and I felt very bad for her. It was so strange. I had this weird feeling, but I also did feel bad for someone who's walking around like that and has to do that in order to feel safe. The topic, or I guess one of the key topics of this piece that you put out on fear and it being used as a tool, is the destructive power of fear. And would you elaborate on that?
It's destructive because, once again, it's not based on reason. You can appeal to a very basic human instinct and do it without too much trouble, fear of the unknown, and it's very effective. You can demonize people very easily. What if? Well, same in the climate arena, which is another issue, of course, but it's a parallel that, well, we're doing these things and it might be impacting. Well, they go from might be to people saying it is, then all of a sudden people are questioning all their actions, because I think another basic instinct, people want to be good. We are social animals. We tend to live in groups, and so you don't want to be a member of the out group. So it's just such a powerful thing, and people use it very cleverly.
I think we're seeing a lot of this group activity going on right now, and there's a thing called mask shaming. If you're not wearing a mask, they put you up on social media, and the group will pounce on you. but it's a frightening thing because this is like a pack mentality that animals use, and it can very easily go from someone just being mad or yelling at you to a physical confrontation, which I think we're seeing more and more of.
Oh, absolutely. The TV, which I tend to look at less and less in terms of the news, because it's frightening. Plus, it's so depressing that to see how this is unleashed. I mean, just you go back in history, and one of my favorite books, once again, I keep on quoting back to it, is by Charles Mackay, written around I always forget the exact date, 1885-ish or somewhere in that era. A Scotsman who wrote this book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And there are various examples he has put together in this rather classic book. The one most popular in terms of people recognizing would be tulipomania, where this exotic bulb, which was found in, I don't know, it was Turkey or someplace in the Mideast there, brought into the Western civilization, as it were, and people are fascinated by it. And within a period of months, these tulip bulbs, they look fairly uninspiring if you ever looked at one. They look like a dried up onion. They do bloom and look beautiful eventually, but they were selling these things. Eventually got to a point where people were spending their entire months or years' wages on this. It became a Las Vegas casino thing, and finally it burned itself out. People had lost a lot of money and whatnot, and it just became another nice, flowering item to have, but not worth your livelihood. And he goes through other things in that book, the witch craze, where people were burning the witches because the crops were failing in France, and you had to have somebody as an out. This goes back to Abel and Cain, actually. And there are the big books written about being an outsider, being the cast-off. There's a group identity, birds of a feather flock together. This is so ingrained in human nature and literature and examples that you just have to say, yeah, it's there. It's like a gun. It's a potent tool, and in the wrong hands, it causes a lot of destruction.
We're talking with Dr. Charles Battig, and the topic today is Fear, the Best Tool of the Ruling Class. I've got my own story. It's a small vignette going back to my Los Angeles days. There was a newspaper there called The Recycler, and this is before the days of the internet, but The Recycler was like something I have here called the Buck Saver, and you'd call in and place in classified ads, and they had various editions all across Southern California, from the East Bay to the San Gabriel Valley and so forth. As a young entrepreneur, I used to buy The Recycler every week, and this is tied into the tulipomania story that you told, but into the modern day. So I would buy it, and I'd look for musical equipment at cheap prices, and I would pick it up and buy it and then flip it, and I'd always, make a few $100s a week back then. There was something that was happening that I couldn't get my mind around, and they were selling something called Billy Beer. And Billy Beer was Billy Carter's picture on a beer can, and it was a limited run beer product called Billy Beer. And I was looking in the Recycler in the miscellaneous section, and week after week there were people selling 6-packs of Billy Beer for astronomical prices. They started in the high hundreds, and they eventually went up into the multiple thousands, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, maybe $5,000. Now, I would see the ads there every week, and I would assume because the ads were there that there was some sort of a market for this thing. But I was astounded as to why somebody would pay that much money for something that was totally worthless. And it happened after maybe a couple of months that the prices started coming down and crashing, and then the product just disappeared from the Recycler. And I think it was a modern day manifestation of exactly what you mentioned with tulipomania.
Yeah, there is at times when these things happen, difficult to go back and trace exactly who was the first person. It's like the coronavirus. Right. Who was the very first person who brought it in? Somehow or other, somebody or other, and somebody else somehow or other repeats it, and then it gets going. And that is a fascinating example. And I'm aware of that publication because I used to live in LA at that time. So, yeah, these things are very hard to trace back. They do tend to burn themselves out. And let's say the tulipomania is the classic one, and there are about a dozen others in that same book. And it's just the way it is. And of course, now with the social media, what used to take somebody whispering over the backyard or a telephone or a town hall meeting or somebody idiot standing in the corner shouting this out, now it's instantaneous. There is no filtering mechanism, and anybody. Well, I may have to walk that back because of Zuckerberg, but basically the concept is anybody can say anything and throw it out there. And the odds are, with billions of people on the earth, you'll find some soulmate out there who agrees with you, and then you get enough of them, and something gets going. And it's just the way it is.
We're talking with Dr. Charles Battig. Today's topic, a recent piece he had published called "Fear, the Best Tool of the Ruling Class." Charles, I want to talk about something that's really important to this whole topic, and it is maybe the driving force behind it. How do politicians and special interests benefit? Let's talk very specifically about this pandemic scare.
Yeah, there are a lot of interests, and once again, it's very hard to tease apart. And different people have different opinions. It's almost like the food triangle, what's the best food to eat, and so on and so forth. Experts, quote unquote, put these things out, and they're revised, and what's top goes to the bottom, and so on and so forth. But anyway, in this case, the whole concept is basically summarized that we really don't know. Okay, we don't know, but I don't know, quote unquote, in quotations, it is very hard for anybody to say. And it's very hard for a politician to say. It's very hard for a scientist to say, or at least an authority who has gained that title as an authority on the subject to say, I don't know, because the population is looking, as always, for an answer. Daddy, why does this happen? Well, you never outgrow that. People, as a group, are looking for answers. They're looking for reassurance, and they're looking for people who normally are supposed to have the answers. So the unfortunate thing is those people have to look authoritative, and we can't look into their deepest thoughts why they come up with what they say, but we can at least speculate. And that's what this is. It's speculation. They give an answer which they honestly believe in. It may be wrong, but they really believe that that's the correct answer. There was a fellow with his computer back in England who had used that computer for, I think, the SARS virus or something else, and plugged in what he thought were the correct parameters, and comes out with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of deaths if we don't do something. And all of a sudden, that starts a panic because, quote unquote, he's the expert. At least he was the expert there in England. So that starts, and then we have a whole variety of speculations. All right, we even get into Bill Gates and his association with funding things, and perhaps funding Dr. Fauci's interests there at NIH, where I spent a number of years parenthetically myself. That the vaccine is the answer. Only the vaccine. We must have a vaccine, and logically, you could say, yeah, vaccine would be terrific. We have a smallpox vaccine. We basically wiped out smallpox. But we also have yearly influenza vaccines, which do not have a great track record. Each year they're reformulated, and it's always a rearview mirror and mixing up these things. Which virus mutations are we facing this coming season for the flu, the common flu? And the success rates, they're in the 40s to 50s or 60s. So there's a lot of questioning. Fauci is carrying the banner for the vaccine. Nothing is going to do it until we get the vaccine, and that leads to all the speculations of why he's saying that, his tie-ins to Bill Gates and blah blah blah. We have other people saying that's what's going on, and this is not such a deadly disease, and therefore we could handle it much better by being more selective in how we approach isolation, which became the next thing. So of course, early on, you could say, as they might have done in the medieval days with walled cities. You just pull up the moat and nobody
Yes.
gets into the walled city. Of course, you're not going to catch what's on the outside until some mouse or rat sneaks in there and starts it. But in any event, isolation is certainly a well-defined medical response. Trouble is, it works well when you have defined a source and you can isolate it. In this case, then we get into the whole Chinese conundrum. Wuhan, did it start there? Did it escape? Was it a secret weapon? Was it any number of things that escaped through the local wet market there? And so by the time it became sort of a fact here in Washington State at that nursing home that something new was going on and dangerous, the virus was out of the bag, as it were. And this particular virus apparently is able to reside in a person without giving symptoms while he's being infected, and has become infectious, not to his knowledge. He's not going around sneezing, high fever, feeling terrible. Once that happens, of course, you can identify it. But the problem here is that he's infectious, he or she is infectious for a week or so before that. So this isolation then becomes a no-win situation unless you do what was done. It's still no win because you have traded off by shutting down the entire economy, basically the world. It's surprising how fast it spread. But anyway, we shut down in the States here. Then you have the secondary effects. Okay, we shut down something which is out of the bag already, hoping to limit its further spread. We didn't have good tools for identifying the asymptomatic people. But pretty soon became obvious that shutting down the economy has its own cost. It has physical costs. People have mental problems. Alcoholism surges because people are not at a productive point doing something every day. They're at home with nothing to do and nothing better to do than get into trouble and so on and so forth. So this has been a terrible consequence of following that. But once again, the people in charge couldn't say they're malicious. They had to do something. They couldn't say we don't know, and they picked what they thought would be the classic things to do. I don't, and I have no way of knowing either way. But I'm not looking for a nefarious bad guy who did this, causing trouble for no good reason. I think it's a consequence of not knowing what would happen, and then proceeding from to do something. As it turns out, certainly in the age group where I should be staying at home,
yes.
The Wall Street Journal today had a very nice chart on the editorial page showing I think it was the U.S. Deaths for people. These are deaths, which is certainly a very good endpoint. Not saying somebody he has the virus. I mean, you can be infected without having clinical symptoms. You can have it and get over it and not know you had it. But being dead is a pretty good endpoint. So they picked 65 and over, those blue lines were like 2 inches tall,
yes.
and the deaths of people under that were like an eighth of an inch tall. So certainly at this point, it's known that you have a more susceptible age group, and even within that age group, I think I can remember reading that even if you're 90 or over, from their study of deaths, and you get it, the chances of a person in that age group, 90 to over, of dying was 10%. So it narrows down to people who are older, who have underlying serious medical diseases. I mean, unfortunately, diabetes and hypertension are are two very well-known multi-system disease entities, and the virus seems to have a predilection for attacking something in people who have those diseases. So you can narrow it down. So there is no need to keep a lot of people locked up now. And I think that's slowly being reversed, the initial lockdown of everybody. And everybody's nervous now. But it's certainly, I think, the experience gained. And when you have a new disease, once again, not trying to want to blame anybody. I mean, you don't know what you're dealing with. It's an unknown. It's a fear. Yes. So if you have a new disease, a new entity, and you don't know what it does, but you know people are dying of what's there, you have to watch for a while. You have to see, well, you have to trace it. That's the science of epidemiology. And unfortunately, people want answers now. As I said in my article, they don't want to become the guinea pig from Mother Nature, and you be the one that you die. And then we find out, oh, you're over 70 and you had diabetes and you're not well treated. Mm-hmm. Now we know that you're the one that would die. People are just naturally don't want to be the one. But I think as time goes on, unfortunately, it's a learning curve. And a lot of people have said stupid things. A lot of people have done very honest work and come out with the wrong answers. And going back to bad things, I go to New York State, and the shipping of elderly patients with coronavirus back into nursing homes and infecting the others stands out in my mind, at least, in one of the most terrible mistakes, if not a stronger word could be used, done by the governor of New York, the mayor there. That was just a terrible choice.
Charles, as we wrap this up, I want to ask you, what are the lessons that should be learned from what we have just been through? Because undoubtedly this will not be the last time we have confronted by such a situation. So what do we take from it?
Yes, well, that gives a chance to speculate. One thing comes back to me from the 60s, which I know very well, and I'm wondering why it doesn't apply as much. It's maybe worn out. People don't care for it or whatever. But I just like the old saying, don't trust people in authority. Brian, I don't trust anybody these days on the internet. But anyway, the skepticism, an intelligent skepticism on the part of people to what authorities say is helpful. It may not solve anything because the people in authority don't know. I just think you have to resort to your own intelligence. Good luck is a big part of it. And question. And from what I read about universities these days, and I see going on in Seattle and other places, a lot of younger generation have not learned that message. The purpose of the university life is not to be instilled with a hatred of your country and everything that's gone before it. It used to be to instill in you the ability to reason and question. You have to have an independent mind and think. With a pandemic like this, there's not a lot of choice to initially make a good choice. But I can't solve what would have been done differently at that point in time when this all started. There are too many factors. But you can see as it plays out, I just see it as a large real-life experiment in epidemiology, mass thought, the inability of political entities to correctly identify what to do correctly, and it's just another page of history of mankind. And as you say, it's going to happen again in some other unknown way, and we just have to be prepared.
I certainly hope we are, and I certainly hope that we learn some of those lessons. Charles, if people would like to read the piece that you've recently had published, where can they find it?
Well, I have it on my own basic website, which I must say it's not a blogging website. It's a website, and must say, with thanks to you, many years ago, I started as an open library online, www.climateis.com. It's just my library of everything pretty much that I've posted. But there are some more recent postings of this as well. Anthony Watts, What Up With This? Is one place. CFACT, CFACT, has published it as well. They are all reprints from the initial posting on American Thinker, which is another wonderful website. and I hope they take the cautionary tale to heart and keep an open mind.
I certainly hope so. Dr. Charles Battig, always a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for joining us on the inaugural edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. We truly appreciate it. And that will wrap it up for this edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Follow us online at schillingshow.com. You can also be a friend on Facebook. And don't forget to support this program while you're there online. Without your help, we could not be here. We'll see you next time on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.